So Bloomberg broke the news today that Saudi Arabia would be interested in targeting $80 a barrel for their oil. What do you think about that?
Oh, it's the first I've heard of it, so I think that's interesting. But ultimately, the market will decide what the price is. And I think where we are today, supply and demand have come back into balance. In fact, actually, if you look at global stocks, they dropped down below the 5-year average last week. And that's why we're seeing prices firming up where they are. But also, we've got low 48 is back now. The rig count's back double what it was a year ago. We think there could be another 1 million barrels a day of production coming out of the US this year. Ultimately, the price will be set by demand and supply. OPEC compliance is pretty strong at the moment, which is why you're seeing prices where they are. But I think as you start to see more production come on from the United States this year in the low 48, up to 1 million barrels a day, that will start to dampen the price a little bit. So it'd really be a question of how much supply can be kept off the market by OPEC.
But hypothetically, if you got 80 in some kind of sustainable basis, how does that change BP's allocation, capital allocation?
Well, our capital framework is pretty strict, so it's sort of $15 to $17 billion. Our break-even price is back down at $50 a barrel. That will trend down to $35 a barrel. If it's at $80, that's surplus cash. That goes back to investors in the framework that we've set up. But I'm not sure that $80 a barrel will be sustainable on a medium-term basis. We think something around $50 to $60 a barrel is more prudent to plan on over the next 3 or 4 years.
How are you planning on being in the Permian?
Well, we're not in the Permian.
I know, so how do you want to be in it?
No, we were in the Permian back in 2010. That was one of the assets that we sold when we joined Deepwater Horizon as part of funding the balance sheet. We've looked at various options for us in the Permian, but it's very hard.
I hear is in the market to sell.
That's what I hear, and I hear there's a lot of people pursuing that particular deal, up to 40 or 50 from what I understand, if you read the news reports. We'll look at the Permian. The key for us is any deals we've looked at would have to be accretive for our shareholders, and it's been really hard to find an accretive deal over the last 3 or 4 years. So we'll continue to look. We have a pretty good low 48 business, about 300,000 barrels a day, mostly gas, about 85% gas. It's got some liquids with it. And we've transformed that business over the last 3 or 4 years with a new team that we brought in from the outside. Permian would be interesting, but there's nothing really there from our perspective that would be accretive on a go-forward.
So if we're looking at a long line for BHP assets, are you right in the back? Are you in the middle? Where would you describe your...
We never talk about where we sit in terms of deals or assets we might like to pursue. We wouldn't want to sort of talk about that publicly. But if there was something interesting, that's something we'd look at. But we have to get back to our capital frame. And if we were to do something like that, we'd have to find a way to fund it within our existing capital frame, and that would be tough. Do
you see more opportunities in natural gas or oil going forward?
I think we see opportunities in both. I think natural gas is one of the fastest growing commodities. I think it's going to be an important part of the energy transition, which is what this conference is all about. And also oil is pretty important. We think oil will peak at some point over the next 20 years, but then probably plateau. So I think more plateau than peak going forward, and therefore we'll look to pursue oil leveraged opportunities for us where we basically think we can add value from a shareholder perspective, so both.
Which are more interesting in terms of financial aspects to buy? Which are cheapest?
Oil tend to be more highly accretive from a returns basis. But if you look at the big domestic gas project we brought on in Oman recently in Kazan, because it's into a domestic gas market, that's pretty attractive. So
how much will that project wind up costing?
I don't have the number straight to hand, but it's a multi-billion-dollar project.
So you're adding to assets. You're looking for accretive assets. You're also selling. You're selling about $2 to $3 billion this year. What are you selling? How's it going?
So far this year, $2 to $3 billion. It's what we call the sort of tail of the portfolio. Our capital employed is about $120 billion. So 2 to 3 is just churn. And we wouldn't normally talk about any specific assets unless they're already in the public domain.
But would it be oil and natural gas? I'm just trying to get a sense of sort of where your mindset is in terms of development.
Well, we sold off about $75 billion of assets after Deepwater Horizon. So there isn't that much left to sell in the upstream portfolio. So a lot of what we've been selling is midstream. You would have seen the Midstream Partners announcement we did last year. And it's really just tail assets now as we look to try and reinvest in the higher end of the tail and divest off the lower end.
So let's talk about geopolitical risk. We got two fronts. We have U.S. sanctions on Russia. How does that wind up affecting BP?
We continue to operate within the sanctions framework. Nothing has changed so far based on what we've seen this week. We have a 20% shareholding, just under 20% with Rosneft. That's strategically important to us. It's one of our most important partners. And we continue to operate and work with them in Russia within the framework that we have. And nothing's changed this week in terms of sanctions that would affect that. But we continue to monitor on a go-forward basis.
Potential trade war between the U.S. and China. When does that start to make you nervous and change how you allocate
like all business, whether it's BP or anybody else, just needs certainty to understand what framework they're operating in. So the sooner that we get some understanding of what the trade arrangements look like between various geographies, then we can plan for the longer term. Our investments are typically over 20 or 30 years, and we have to look through all of that, but nothing's settled. We'll wait for the dust to settle and see where things come out.
All right, Brian, really great to get your perspective. Thank you so much. Brian Gilvary, the CFO of BP, who, by the way, is a triathlon athlete and represents the UK in the, what's it called?
H group.
The H group triathlon. Pretty amazing.